The fall of the P-51 Mustang. It begins here. At an abandoned airfield somewhere in the American Southwest. The kind of place where the wind whispers secrets through broken hangar doors, where tumbleweeds dance across runways that once launched warriors into the sky, and where the ghosts of a different age seem to linger in the dust. In the corner of this forgotten hangar, beneath years of neglect and a canvas shroud, sits what was once the most feared machine in the sky. The P-51 Mustang. The aircraft that turned the tide of World War II. The fighter that escorted bombers deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and brought them home. The machine that pilots spoke of not as a tool, but as a partner, an extension of their very soul. This is the story of how the greatest fighter of its generation became obsolete. How the king of the skies lost his throne. Not to an enemy, but to something far more unstoppable. Progress itself. Act 1, The Darkest Hour. To understand the fall of the Mustang, you must first understand its rise. And that story begins in the darkest days of the air war over Europe. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was failing. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators carried the war to Nazi Germany every day. They struck factories, refineries, railways, cities. But they paid a terrible price. The bombers flew deep into German territory, but their fighter escorts couldn't follow. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings simply didn't have the range. Somewhere over Belgium or Holland, the escorts would waggle their wings in farewell and turn back toward England. And that's when the slaughter began. The Luftwaffe was waiting. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rose in coordinated waves. German fighter pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of kills, picked apart the bomber formations with ruthless efficiency. On a single mission to Schweinfurt in October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers and 600 men in one afternoon. 1 in 4 aircraft that took off that morning never came home. The mathematics were brutal. At this rate, bomber crews had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their required 25 missions. Entire squadrons were being wiped out in weeks. The Allied daylight bombing campaign was on the verge of collapse. Generals and politicians faced an impossible choice: abandon daylight bombing entirely, ceding the skies to the Luftwaffe, or find a fighter that could go all the way to Berlin and back. They needed a miracle. Act 2. Birth of a legend. The miracle came from an unlikely source. North American Aviation, a company that had never built a fighter before, designed the P-51 in just 117 days. The Mustang was revolutionary from the start. Its designers, led by James Dutch Kindleberger and chief engineer Edgar Schmude, created something that had never been seen before. The wings used a laminar flow airfoil, incredibly thin and smooth, that sliced through the air with almost no drag. The fuselage was sculpted like a work of art, every curve calculated for speed. Even the air intake for the radiator was designed to create thrust rather than drag. But the early Mustangs, powered by American Allison engines, had a fatal flaw. They performed beautifully at low altitude but gasped for air above 15,000 feet. And the air war over Europe was being fought at 25,000 feet and higher. The Mustang was fast, elegant, and deadly. But in the high-altitude war over Germany, it was almost useless. Then came the marriage that changed history. British test pilots had flown the Mustang and seen its potential. They suggested fitting it with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The Merlin was supercharged, designed specifically for high-altitude performance. When the Merlin met the Mustang's airframe, something magical happened. The P-51B could now fly at 440 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. It could climb faster than a Messerschmitt. It could turn tighter than a Focke-Wulf. And with drop tanks, it had a range of over 2,000 miles. For the first time in the war, there was a fighter that could escort the bombers all the way to the target and back. But it was more than just performance numbers. Pilots loved the Mustang. They said it flew like it was reading your mind. The controls were light, responsive, harmonized perfectly. Visibility from the bubble canopy was exceptional. The engine ran smooth as silk. Lieutenant Colonel John D. Landers, who flew both the P-38 and P-51, said, "The Mustang was the best fighter ever designed. It would do anything you asked of it, and then a little bit more." Colonel Clarence Bud Anderson, who scored 16 kills in his Mustang, called it the finest fighter plane ever built, bar none. In early 1944, Mustangs arrived over Germany in force. Within weeks, the air war changed completely. German fighters that had once freely attacked bomber formations now faced swarms of Mustangs. The hunters became the hunted. Mustang pilots racked up kills at an astonishing rate. They didn't just protect the bombers. They sought out and destroyed German fighters wherever they could find them, in the air, on the ground, at their airfields. By D-Day in June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been swept from the skies. Allied air supremacy was absolute. And the Mustang was the primary reason why. The strategic bombing campaign that had nearly collapsed in 1943 now proceeded with devastating effectiveness. German industry was crippled. Oil refineries burned. Transportation networks crumbled. And everywhere, flying overhead, was the unmistakable profile of the P-51 Mustang. For a shining moment in history, the Mustang was untouchable. The undisputed king of the skies. But in aviation, as in everything, nothing stays untouchable for long. Act 3, the future arrives. Even as the Mustang dominated the skies, a new era was being born. November 1944. An American P-51 pilot on patrol over Germany spots something impossible. A German fighter with no propeller, flying faster than anything he's ever seen, leaves a trail of smoke and vanishes into the clouds before he can even react. The Messerschmitt Me-262. The world's first operational jet fighter. Powered by twin Jumo 004 turbojet engines, the Me-262 could fly at 540 miles per hour. 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang. At that speed difference, if a Me-262 pilot didn't want to fight, there was nothing a Mustang could do about it. When they did fight, the results were often one-sided. The 262 carried 4 30mm cannons that could tear a bomber apart with a single burst. It could climb to altitude faster than any Allied fighter could follow. And when bounced by Mustangs, it could simply dive away at speeds that would tear the wings off a piston engine fighter. Bomber crews learned to fear the jet. One pass from a 262, and a flying fortress would tumble from the sky in pieces. Fortunately for the Allies, the Me-262 arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages, production bottlenecks, and Hitler's interference kept only a handful operational. Had Germany deployed jet fighters 2 years earlier, the air war might have ended very differently. But the message was clear. The age of the propeller-driven fighter was ending. No matter how perfect the P-51's design was, no matter how skilled its pilots were, no piston engine could compete with jet propulsion. The laws of physics had spoken. When the war ended in May 1945, every major nation immediately began developing jet fighters. The United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, even France. The race was on to build the first generation of operational jet fighters. And in that race, the Mustang was already obsolete. By 1947, the US Air Force had the P-80 Shooting Star. By 1949, the F-86 Sabre. Both jets, both faster than the Mustang, both representing the future. Across America, Mustangs were pulled from active service and sent to storage facilities. Entire squadrons were disbanded. Pilots who had flown the Mustang to victory over Germany now transitioned to jets. The airplane that had been built in 1943 was out of date by 1948. Some were sold as surplus to foreign air forces. Some went to civilian buyers for a few $1,000s. Some were simply scrapped, melted down for aluminum. The Mustang's war was over. Or so everyone thought. Act 4, the last campaign. June 25, 1950. North Korean forces, backed by Soviet tanks and artillery, pour across the 38th parallel. The Korean War has begun. The United States responds immediately, sending its new jet fighters into combat. F-80 Shooting Stars and F-84 Thunderjets engage North Korean aircraft and attack ground targets. But within weeks, a problem emerges. Jets, it turns out, are not ideal for the kind of war being fought in Korea. They burn enormous amounts of fuel, limiting their time over the battlefield. Their engines are vulnerable to small arms fire, and even rifle bullets can cause catastrophic damage. They fly too fast to effectively identify and engage small ground targets like trucks, artillery, or troops in trenches. What the Air Force needs is something that can fly low and slow, loiter over the battlefield for hours, take punishment from ground fire, and still make it home. So they go back to the desert storage facilities. Back to the mothballed squadrons. Back to an airplane they thought they'd never need again. They bring back the Mustang. Hundreds of P-51s are pulled from storage, refurbished, and shipped to Korea. They are redesignated F-51s now, the P-4 Pursuit having been replaced by F-4 Fighter in the new Air Force designation system. But they are the same airplanes that flew over Germany. Some still have kill markings from World War II painted on their fuselages. In Korea, the Mustang finds new purpose as a ground attack aircraft. Flying at treetop level, F-51 pilots strafe supply convoys, destroy tanks, hit bridges, support troops in desperate battles along the Pusan perimeter and the Incan landing. They're good at it. Better than the jets, in many ways. But this time, the Mustang isn't the hunter. It's the hunted. November 1950. Chinese forces enter the war, and with them comes a new threat. The MiG-15. A Soviet-designed jet fighter that makes the F-80 look slow. It can fly at 670 miles per hour. It can reach 50,000 feet. Its cannons can destroy a Mustang with a single burst. And there are hundreds of them, flown by Soviet and Chinese pilots. When a MiG-15 encountered a Mustang, it wasn't a fight. It was an execution. The jet could attack from any angle, at any altitude, at any time. The Mustang pilot never had a chance. By the time he saw the MiG, it was already past him, climbing away at a speed he couldn't match. Lieutenant James L. Glessner, an F-51 pilot, described it: "When the MiG showed up, all we could do was get on the deck and run. If they wanted to kill you, they killed you. There was nothing you could do about it." But the real killer wasn't enemy fighters. It was ground fire. In World War II, the Mustang had flown at high altitude, where anti-aircraft fire was relatively ineffective. In Korea, flying at treetop level to attack ground targets, every enemy soldier with a rifle was a threat. The F-51 had no armor on the underside. No protection for the radiator, which was mounted under the fuselage. A single bullet in the radiator, and the engine would overheat and seize within minutes. F-51 pilots flew with the knowledge that every mission might be their last. The survival rate for ground attack missions was lower than almost any other role in the war. The airplane that had once been the pride of the Air Force was now a death trap. By 1953, the F-51 was pulled from frontline service in Korea. It had done its job, but at a terrible cost. It was the Mustang's last war. And it had shown, painfully and clearly, that the era of the piston engine fighter was truly over. Act 5, The Age of Missiles. The world that emerged from Korea was a different world entirely. The 1950s brought a revolution in military aviation that would have seemed like science fiction just a decade earlier. Missiles replaced guns. The new fighters carried Sidewinder and Sparrow missiles that could track and destroy targets from miles away. Dogfighting, the art the Mustang had been built for, was declared obsolete. Radar replaced eyesight. Pilots no longer needed to spot the enemy visually. Electronics did it for them, tracking targets beyond visual range. Computers replaced instinct. Fire control systems calculated lead, deflection, and range automatically. And supersonic speed replaced agility. The new fighters, F-100 Super Sabres, F-104 Starfighters, could fly faster than sound. Twice as fast as sound. What did it matter if you could turn tightly when your opponent could simply blow through your formation at Mach 2? Compare the numbers. The P-51 Mustang, top speed 437 miles per hour, service ceiling 41,900 feet, armament 6.50 caliber machine guns, range 1,650 miles. The F-100 Super Sabre, top speed 864 miles per hour, service ceiling 50,000 feet, armament 420mm cannons and guided missiles, or nuclear weapons. It wasn't even close. The Mustang was a creature of wind and oil and leather helmets and human touch. It was built for a kind of warfare where pilots looked each other in the eye before pulling the trigger. That world was gone. The new world was about radar locks and missile launches and engagements fought at distances where you never even saw your enemy. The P-51 simply didn't belong anymore. And that was the final nail in its coffin. Act 6, The Quiet Death. There was no grand ceremony to mark the Mustang's end. No final salute echoed across the airfields where it had once reigned supreme. It simply faded away. Slowly, year by year, quietly and without fanfare. Squadrons were disbanded. The pilots moved on to jets or left the service entirely. Hangars closed. The distinctive sound of the Merlin engine grew rarer. Air National Guard units, the last to fly the Mustang operationally, finally retired their fleets in 1957. Thousands of Mustangs were sold as military surplus. Some went to foreign air forces, where they flew for a few more years before meeting the same fate. Some were bought by civilians, converted to racing aircraft, or simply kept as cherished relics of a vanished age. Many were scrapped, melted down, turned into aluminum siding for suburban houses or car parts. The metal that had once soared over Europe now formed the mundane components of peacetime prosperity. And some were simply abandoned. Left to rot under open skies, victims of economics and changing times. Magnificent machines that had cost the equivalent of millions of dollars to build, now worth less than the land they sat on. The aircraft that had once terrified the Luftwaffe, that had escorted bombers through walls of flak, that had turned the tide of the greatest war in history, now sat silent, forgotten, dissolving slowly into dust. Those that survived found a different kind of immortality. Airshow performers, warbird racers, museum pieces behind velvet ropes. The Mustang now thrilled crowds at county fairs instead of fighting over Berlin. Which is perhaps the cruelest fate of all for a warrior. Not to die in battle, but to become entertainment. The P-51 Mustang didn't die in fire and glory. It didn't fall from the sky in its final combat mission. It faded away in silence, killed by the very thing it had helped create. A world where technology moved so fast that even legends became obsolete. Act 7. But legends never die. And yet, whenever a Mustang engine starts, something magical happens. Pilots stop what they're doing and turn their heads. Children press their faces against fences. Veterans close their eyes and remember friends who never came home. Because the P-51 was never just an airplane. It was a symbol of a very specific moment in human history. A time when the world hung in the balance. When ordinary people did extraordinary things. When courage was measured in altitude and victory in horsepower. A time when heroes in leather jackets flew into hell itself to save the world. Today, of the 15,000 Mustangs built, fewer than 200 still fly. Each one is worth millions. Each one is maintained by people who understand they're not just preserving a machine, but a memory. The memory of what it meant to be brave in the darkest of times. The P-51 Mustang was killed by progress. By jets and missiles and supersonic speed and a world that moved on without it. But some things transcend their time. Some things become more than their function. Some things live on, not because they are still useful, but because they remind us of who we were when we needed to be our best. The Mustang lost its throne. But its spirit will outlive every jet that replaced it.